So resume recording. There we go. All right. Like I said, my name is Kerry Grable. I'm the home horticulture educator for Purdue Extension, Marion County. You see a little bit about my educational background, a little bit about my work background. I did serve as a nursery crops consultant with the University of Kentucky for about 9 years, a section grower for a wholesale greenhouse operation in Noblesville for a few seasons. And I am now in the home horticulture position. My remit is education pertaining to home horticulture, home gardening. Right, slide. If you want to advance for me, that'd be nice. There we go. So a little bit about Purdue Extension, Marion County. We provide relevant and research-based educational services to Marion County residents and organizations who share our passion for building young leaders, creating strong families and healthy communities, developing profitable businesses and trusted employees, and growing a vibrant natural environment. We are also very committed to DEI. We value underappreciated communities. We celebrate human differences, and we are trying to address this by increasing our programming outreach to those communities in need. We try to have representation on all of our extension boards and committee, and we try to instill a kind and trusting culture in our office through the actions we take and the words that we use. So, today's topic, plant propagation. What is it? Quite simply, it is the method of creating new plants. So there are two general avenues that we can take with plant propagation, and that is going to be the sexual propagation and the asexual propagation. So sexual propagation is just the natural process by which plants will develop new plants. This is typically through the creation of seeds. This is combining the genetics of both parents into a new gene code to create a new plant. With asexual propagation, this is what we often call vegetative propagation. And quite simply, we are creating clones. We are creating something that is genetically identical to the parent plant. And we'll talk about why that is desired here in a second. So for seed propagation, again, we're combining those genetics of two parents, and we are coming up with something new entirely. It can be less expensive, and it sometimes may become the only way to propagate these plants, depending on the species. The disadvantages might include variability. We are going to lose that some of those characteristics of the parents when we create something new. It is a longer term to create a new plant, and sometimes can take special handling for certain seeds. And we will cover that in a second as well. A little bit about seed saving. I am going to go through seeds quickly. We've covered seeds extensively in previous Lunch and Learn, so I do want to move through the seed propagation and get to the vegetative stuff. So again, with seed saving, this can be done by experienced gardeners. You need to know the proper techniques for what you want to save, how you're going to save it, how you're going to store it, that kind of thing. It can help you reduce the annual startup of the garden by having your own seed sources. And it is a way that you can preserve the best performing plants. So if you have something, a strain of plants that are going very well in your garden, it is a method by which you can carry those on season to season. Some seeds that you should not save. This is primarily why I wanted to throw the seed saving in there, is to reinforce this idea. Hybrid plants, you should not be keeping that seed. So you can encounter issues with that. Same thing with plants that are easily cross-pollinated, sweet corn, squash, pumpkin. The problem with saving this seed is you never really know what genetics you're getting. So again, we're talking about things that easily cross-pollinate, and we just cannot be as sure of the parentage of that seed. Some bean seeds may carry viruses and other diseases from one season to the next as well. So in general, we need to do a little bit of reading, a little bit of research when we're saving seed to make sure that we are not going to encounter any of these issues. So when should we harvest seed that we're going to save? Just like the timing of produce harvests, there are certain times that are better than others to harvest a seed. And multiple seed harvests might be necessary, as you might have seeds maturing at different times throughout the year. So it says here that most garden fruit mature over the course of 4 to 10 weeks, and seed harvesting can be conducted throughout that process. So that is going to take a little bit of knowledge of, again, what we're growing and the life cycle of that plant. Again, research is always your best friend. Know what you're growing and know what you're going to encounter across that year. Some plants may go to seed with a little bit more given time. So for example, cilantro goes from germination to setting seed in 100 days, while it takes squash 150 days to go from germination to setting seed. Some plants might need encouragement to begin their reproductive cycle. This is something that is used in ornamentals actually quite a bit. So if we introduce a stress factor into that plant, it's going to go from saying, hey, I'm nice, I'm happy, I'm healthy, I don't need to worry about reproduction, to I'm now stressed and I need to start thinking about the future. I'm going to change my growth patterns over to reproduction and start setting seed. So some water stress can help with that. We might need to vary up the nutrition that the plant has available to it. But once we begin that reproductive cycle, make sure that we are reintroducing proper watering so that we can help develop healthy seeds. So this is a new section that I did not talk about previously in previous Lunch and Learn, so I wanted to introduce some new topics. So hopefully some of these are new for you. So the idea of seed dormancy. So in some cases, there might be a hard seed coat that we have to get through in one way or another. So in nature, this is going to be done in a variety of ways. There might be microbes that break down the seed coat. They might go through the digestive tract of a bird or an animal. They could go through a freeze or a thawing cycle, or they might even go through fire. So a lot of times this is going to be more common in the fruits and nuts. A lot of our native species might have a little bit more seed dormancy issues that we might have to overcome. So there's a couple of terms that you will hear in relation to seed dormancy. The first is scarification, and this is the process of mechanically breaking through a seed coat to counter seed dormancy. Excuse me. So for example, some of the ways that we can do scarification, that might be dipping the seed in sulfuric acid for a short period. I'm not going to leave it in there long, just enough to start breaking down that seed coat. We might soak the seed in hot water, or maybe immerse it for a short period of time in boiling water. Frequently, what we're doing is just scratching the seed coat in some way. This could be done with a metal file or sandpaper or something, just where we're going to create a wound in that seed coat to start adding moisture to the insides of that seed. Again, you got to do your research. You need to know the needs of the seed that you're trying to germinate. So scarification is not always needed, but if you've done your reading and it mentions scarification, these are some of the methods by which we can do that. The other one that you'll frequently hear is stratification. And so this is referring to the ways that we are countering temperature and moisture related dormancy for some seeds. So there's a lot of different ways to counter stratification. Frequently, if we're doing bulk seeds, we're just going to get ourselves a nice Ziploc bag. We're going to put our seed down in that, as well as maybe some sand, some sawdust, peat moss, or vermiculite, maybe even perlite. I've had good success with perlite. These things, vermiculite, perlite, things like that might be preferable because it is sterile when you get it from a good source. They have great water holding capacity, and they can be moist, but not necessarily wet. So we're going to put all that in a bag, and we are going to either, depending on whether it needs a cold cycle or not, maybe put it in a refrigerator or just a cool space. And that way we are going to leave them in there until they start germinating and then remove them and grow them on. There are certain seeds that might benefit from a fungicide treatment prior to this. Some of the ones that are more susceptible to rot in that environment. So again, placing them into plastic bags and sealable containers. Again, sealing is nice. We're going to try to eliminate as much contamination as possible. And then again, we're going to place that in a refrigerator I know some propagators who have refrigerators only for stratifying seeds. They can set that refrigerator to the temperature that is needed exactly for that. So we can really fine tune the system as well. There are situations where both of these things might be required. Frequently, we would do the scarification before the stratification. Again, this is just countering that seed coat so that we can start getting some moisture into that seed. So do your research again. Do not think that all seed needs this. Think about things like maybe oaks with those large waxy seeds. That's a good example. So do your reading and make sure that you are not rotting out your seed unless you have to put them in these situations. All right. So the bulk of the talk today is really going to focus in on vegetative propagation. And I know that I'm not going to cover every method. I wish we had time to cover everything today, but we certainly do not. But I do want to leave some time for questions as well when we get through this. So with vegetative propagation, again, we are talking about creating clones. This, again, is the asexual propagation. It is a great way to maintain a species, particularly if we are trying to propagate something for a specific trait. So useful for carrying on certain fruits, useful for carrying on certain flower species, certain variegations in those flowers. So these clones are groups of plants that are identical to their one single parent, and they are only propagated asexually. So a couple of examples here, a couple of unfortunate examples here, let's put it that way. The Bartlett pear and the delicious apple. These are some very historic varieties that are examples of clonally propagated plants that have been maintained using this process. So there are, again, like I said, many different ways to clonally propagate something. Cuttings, layering, and division are the ones we're going to talk about today. I apologize that we didn't get to budding and grafting. We just have too much to go through, but maybe in a future presentation we'll cover budding and grafting as well. So cuttings. When I think about vegetative propagation, this is where my mind goes. I think about cuttings. So this is just cutting off a portion of a plant and then inducing that stem to root in some way. So we are going to place that stem in an environment that is inducive of rooting. And then once roots have been formed on that stem, we have created a new independent plant, a new self-sufficient plant. This plant is going to be identical genetically to its parent plant. And hopefully it will be identical in terms of variegations and looks to that parent plant. So if the parent plant is variegated or it has multiple colored foliage, then the new plant will hopefully have the same thing. So if the parent plant is a female, like a holly or a ginkgo, then hopefully that new plant will be female as well. So propagating by cuttings will allow you to keep those specific traits that we're interested in. So with stem cuttings, these can be taken from herbaceous plants and woody plants and shrubs. These stem cuttings are, when you think about propagating your house plants, your pothos, your what else have I been playing around with? So a lot of house plants. This is frequently how we're propagating those. So because the new growth of trees and shrubs hardens as the summer progresses, cuttings taken at different times of the year vary in their ability to form roots. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood in the next few slides. I don't want you to confuse this with the terminology of trees. What this merely means is the state of the plant, the time of year we're taking it, how mature that plant material is in any one given year. So we're not talking about a softwood like a pine versus a hardwood like a maple. We're talking about, okay, it's a woody plant that just hasn't hardened off yet. And we'll cover that a little bit more. So the softwood and the herbaceous cuttings are more likely to develop roots and become independent plants. And then the hardwood cuttings, those that are taking from wood that is hardened off, are less likely to root. So for our herbaceous plants again, uh, these are stem cuttings. We are putting them frequently in water, but not always. I like to do it in water. I'm sure you've all seen these lovely little jar things that are hangable on your wall, or you can set them on your shelf. I love this. I think this is taking plant propagation, and we are bringing this into our home as an aesthetic. So I think it's lovely to look at the entire time. And then at the end of it, I have a new plant I can start, and then I can reuse these jars and start some more plants. So this is certainly kind of a gardening trend. If you're interested in gardening trends, these containers are ways that we are bringing the gardening aesthetic inside. You see there someone taking a cutting of a monstera. I get asked that a lot. Yes, you can root these in water. We have been playing with that in this office, and it has been successful. So the very easy, the simplest way of propagation is we're going to take that stem cutting and we're going to stick it in water and let it root. So again, softwood cuttings, these are the soft, supple growth, first year growth. This is new growth of a woody plant. So we are typically looking at taking these between May and July. Shoots at the softwood stage will snap easily when bent. The youngest leaves have not yet reached their mature size. And again, try not to confuse that terminology of softwood and hardwood. With semi-hardwood, these are taken from the current season's growth after the wood has matured. So the wood has now turned from a soft growth into a woody growth. The wood is firm and the leaves are full size. This occurs mid-July to early fall for most plants. So many broadleaf evergreens, boxwood, holly, rhododendron, can be propagated by semi-hardwood cuttings. And then hardwood cuttings are prepared from shoots that grew the previous summer. So they are cut in winter or early spring while the plant is still dormant. The wood is firm and doesn't bend easily. And this is useful for rooting some deciduous shrubs and needled evergreens. That's how we do those. All right, so I've thrown terminology at you. What does any of that actually mean? So here we're going to talk about actually doing this cutting process. So some of the things that we have to overcome when we're taking these cuttings, we are severing this plant from its parent plant, so it no longer has the ability to uptake water. So the excess water loss can lead to death. The wound that we're making with the cutting can make the cutting itself susceptible to disease. So we always need to think about sterilize our cutting equipment, make sure that we are always using clean cutting equipment. And then the new roots must be formed as rapidly as possible if the plant is to survive. So we do need to move these plants through the rooting stage and get them self-sufficient. So when it comes to the water loss, how are we going to handle that? So first of all, we need to start with plant material that is healthy. We need to make sure that that plant material is very well hydrated. So we can water the plant very well the day before we take our cuttings. And we want to take that cutting before the heat of the day has allowed that plant to lose any water content. Once we have made that cutting, once we've harvested our cuttings, we want to do what we can to minimize the loss of water. So we want to process the cutting immediately as quick as possible, and we'll get into how to process them here in a second. If we can't process them quickly, we're going to stand the cut in water, like we've already talked about, or place the cutting in a bag with a damp paper towel and store it out of the direct sun. If it's a frost-tolerant plant, you might be able to put them into the refrigerator for a while. For stem cutting, so this is how we're going to process these cuttings. We want to remove some of those leaves. Most of the water will be lost through the leaves, so we want to decrease that surface area of leaf, uh, and that will decrease the water loss. So you want to remove about half to 2/3 of the leaves. And then if they are large leaves, you can go ahead and cut on those leaves. You do not want to defoliate the entire cutting. We need to remember that this cutting is going to have to feed itself, and it's going to rely on those leaves that are left for photosynthesis to create foods while it is forming its own root system. So do not remove all leaves. We want to keep them humid. So if we are sticking them in a soil, once we have them stuck in that soil, we need to create a humid environment. You can do this with a plastic bag. You can use straws or wooden sticks around the edge of the pot to hold the bag away from the cutting. You want to place the pot in a bright area, but not in direct sunlight, so that the leaves will receive the light they need, but the plant doesn't get overly warm. The plastic bag ensures the humidity, and it slows the rate of water loss. Now, we say plastic bag, but there are a lot of things on the market. You see here just a tray that is designed to have a shell that encompasses it. You can see how humid it is in that. I have been to many propagation nurseries where they build their own humidity tent. So if you really get into this and you really want to start propagating some woody plants, it might be worthwhile to invest in your own professional setup. I apologize that I no longer have the photos that I used to have, and I had some great ones of propagation. I wish I still had access to them, but a lot of propagation guys will take a bench and make a tray on it, and they'll use sand or soil or perlite or vermiculite, whatever they're using. They'll fill that bench, and they'll put all their cuttings in there. And then they'll make a liftable tent that they can just lift it up and work on it, and then close the tent back around it. And that holds all the moisture in that environment. Some greenhouses might have misters. So if you are trying to rapidly root some really soft materials, misters are a possibility. Again, this is a balance. So if you'll recall your plant pathology, this is not necessarily an ideal situation in terms of plant disease. So we have to keep an eye on our plant disease. But we are just going to try something to keep that moisture in the plant. All right, so how do we encourage root formation? So we're going to want a mixture of maybe 50% vermiculite, 50% perlite. This provides sufficient air and water to support good root growth, but it is also well drained. And it will not create an overly moist environment. So the same can be said for any just really well-drained potting soil. If your cuttings are frequently rotting before they get to the rooting stage, then you can know that maybe we're using a mix that's a little bit too heavy. Maybe we want to move over to something that dries down a little bit better. You can add in that vermiculite and perlite to increase its air holding capacity and try and dry down that environment. If it is the top of the environment that's rotting out frequently, then maybe we need to reduce that humidity that we've added. So there's a number of ways that we can adjust this environment. The cuttings do need energy, like we said, to create these roots. So again, do not starve them of light. Do not starve them of leaf surface. Again, that is a balance. We want to keep the leaf surface balanced to something it can support by drawing up water without having too much water loss and still having enough surface area to create food. So again, that's bright light, but not direct sunlight. So if you have a light setup that you had been using for your seedlings earlier in the season, by all means, that's something else you can do with those grow lights later in the season, is put your cuttings under those. So rooting hormones. This is an old friend from the greenhouse industry, frequently used to help get our cuttings underway. So a little about the science behind that. So auxin is a naturally occurring plant hormone, and this is what stimulates root formation. There's a lot of different products on the market that are sold as rooting hormones. You don't always have to have it. Some things you're probably not going to be successful without it. There's a lot of things you will be successful without it. A lot of times it is a question of just speeding up the process. You do need to be careful with it. Keep in mind that whatever part of the stem that you put in contact with this hormone is going to form roots. So think about the anatomy of your plant. You probably don't want roots all the way up to the first leaf. Leave some area for stem. The two primary rooting hormones that we are concerned with are IBA, and I'm going to make the attempt here. It's indole butyric acid, and NAA, which is naphthalene acetic acid. These are the products that we see most frequently on the market. I personally have the most experience with IBA, but I know that NAA is just as good of a product. So you can get it in a powder form, you can get it in a liquid form. Again, both of these are very effective. It's really, in my opinion, a personal preference, which one you use. If you're going to be dipping a lot of your cuttings, I find the liquid to be easier. If I'm doing fewer, then I might just dip my cutting in water and then dip it in the powder. Again, it's just however you want to set yourself up. So 1,000 parts per million is used most often for our herbaceous and our softwood cuttings. And then somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 part per million are used for the semi-hardwood and hardwood cuttings. And again, this is just a concentration. Like every other gardening chemical out there, follow the label. Your label will hopefully provide you with guidance on what it can be used on and at what rate it needs to be used on. It says there liquid formulations can be used at a low or high concentration for softwood cuttings, respectively. So again, not always necessary. So in the greenhouse, when we were concerned with a fast turnover, for example, with our English ivy, yes, we would use a rooting hormone. That being said, if you go take a cutting of English ivy and put it in water, it will eventually root. It will just be slower. So another great opportunity for research, another great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the plant that we're trying to propagate. A helpful tactic, but not necessary in every situation. Bottom heat. So cuttings will root more quickly and reliably if we have warm rooting mix, warm soil underneath it. So when I say warm, I don't mean hot. The excessive heat could be detrimental. So we want to keep it somewhere between 65 and 75 degrees. So if we are rooting somewhere like a cool garage or something like that, then we might consider bottom heat. There are, like we know from starting seeds, there are plenty of heating mats available on the market. Please use something that is designed for this purpose and not your heating pad that you use for your back. Those things are not designed for the moisture. So please do use something designed for this. When I go back to my nursery example of their benches that just had sand or perlite or vermiculite, what they would do, because these were unheated greenhouses, they would have a hot water boiler and they would run little thin tubes through that media, and that would keep that media just warm enough. They would have a thermostat in there and that would keep it just warm enough to induce rooting. So again, if you're just an extreme hobbyist and you want to get yourself really set up to make some cuttings, there's a lot of fun things you can do to really improve your situation with bottom heat. All right, so how are we going to make these cuttings? So let's start with the herbaceous and the softwood stem cuttings. So we are going to start by cutting off a piece of stem. This is going to be around 2 to 6 inches long, and there should be at least 3 sets of leaves on the cutting itself. And then we're going to trim the cutting. So we're going to make the bottom cut just below a node. And again, going back to what we know about plant anatomy, a node is where the leaf or a bud joins the stem. So we're going to cut just below that. And then we're going to remove 1/2 to 2/3 of the leaves, starting from the bottom of the cutting, and cut the large leaves in half. And we do not want any flowers or flower buds or anything like that, or any fruit or anything. So we're going to remove all of that as well. So you can see in the top photo where we've made our cut. You can see in the middle photo where we have processed that. So we have removed some of the leaves lower down on the stem. We have cut the large leaf in half to reduce that leaf surface area to reduce our water loss. And that is now our processed cutting. And then again, we have the optional third step of dipping it in rooting hormone and then sticking it. So in terms of sticking, so we want our media damp to start with, but we do want it drained. We don't want it waterlogged, but we want it well irrigated and then drained. We're going to make a hole. If our stem is very pliable, we can't necessarily rely on it to go down into the soil nicely. So if we have a pliable stem, we might use a pencil or something to create the hole. And then we're going to put that cutting in the hole and then firm the rooting mix around it. If we have any leaves that are touching the surface of the mix, we want to trim them back. We do not want our leaf material to be touching the soil. Remember, this is going to be a very wet environment. And then you can place several cuttings in one pot so long as they are not touching. So if you are direct sticking, there's an industry term for you. If you're direct sticking into your finished pot, I would actually encourage you to put several cuttings into that pot because we want a nice full pot as opposed to a single strand of pothos or whatever it is you're propagating. So again, you can put several of these around that pot. We're going to place that pot into our humid environment. Again, in this example, we have a plastic bag. We're going to try and make sure that bag is not touching the leaves. And then that entire setup is going to be placed into a warm, bright spot. Again, keeping it out of direct sunlight to avoid that heat. Every few days, we're going to start checking the rooting mix to make sure it's damp and then water it as necessary. Then make sure that we are discarding any excess water that's collecting into the bottom of that moist environment. After 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to start checking to see if the roots have formed. We called this tugging back. So again, we're just kind of pinching our cutting and pulling on it a little bit. And if it stays put, if it tugs back, we know that we have some roots forming. So if there are no roots, that cutting is just going to come right out. It's not going to have any tug back. So if that's the case, again, continue on with that process. Once we do have roots formed, we are going to slowly start transitioning that cutting to relying on those roots. So we're going to start drying it down, and this is a gradual process. We're going to lower the humidity. We're going to decrease the frequency with which we are watering. We're going to open that humid environment up to the surrounding air a little bit more every day and wean it off of that environment. And then after that process is done, you have yourself a new plant and you can move it into its permanent home. For hardwood cuttings. So we're going to pick a nice robust stem. Again, we're going to start with the healthiest plant material we can. So for hardwood cuttings, we want a section that was formed over the previous summer. And this really depends on the species about how long it's going to be. It may be a foot or two long. It could be much shorter than that. So then we're going to trim that cutting like we did before. Again, we're starting just below a node. And with a pencil, gently make a line 2 inches above this cut where we started from. The portion of the stem between the cut and the line will be in the rooting mix. So that is just a guide with how far down we're going to put that into our media. Apply the rooting hormone to the lowest 1 inch of stem and place it into the damp rooting mix up to the pencil line. And then you're going to, again, pack it in and firm it in. Now, like I said, with the hormone, do remember that you're going to get root initiation wherever you have contact with that stem. So that's why we're giving ourselves this baseline of a visible marker to show how far to dip it into the hormone and then how far to put it down into the soil. I have goofed in the past with this stuff. I've goofed in the past with rooting hormone, and you will have roots all the way up that plant, all the way up to the leaf. So you do need to be careful with it. You may be able to get 2 to 5 cuttings from each stem. So if you have a section of cutting that is a foot or two, think about where you make your cuts, how many leaflets you're leaving, and you may be able to process several of these cuttings for one stem. So again, you can just repeat those steps of cutting below a node, leaving yourself enough room to put it into the soil, and then have enough leaf material left to support that cutting. Just remember that the plant should remain in the same orientation as which it was growing, so don't get it flipped upside down. The bottom should always end up in the potting mix. So if you have a cold garage and a heating system to warm the rooting mix, you can place that pot on the heating system in the cold garage. This cold air will keep the buds from opening and forming leaves, and the heater will keep the mix warm enough for roots to form. And again, that's 65 to 75 degrees. It's acceptable for the air temperature to go below freezing as long as the heater can keep the rooting mix between 65 and 75 degrees. This is a publication here that you can use to help you make these cold frames. This is, again, if you go to Google and you put in Purdue extension HO-53, you'll find this publication. When finding publications from Purdue, Google's your friend. If you don't have access to that cold garage and heating system, you can place the pot in a plastic bag like we talked about before, and then put that in a warm room. And in 2 or 3 weeks, the buds will open, but the plastic bag should be kept, you should keep the humidity around the leaves high and prevent the excess water loss again, like we talked about. Again, we want the bright sun spot that does not overheat. And we want to keep that rooting mix moist, but not overlogged. Again, that same 2 to 3 week schedule, we're going to check for roots and see where we are. And then once we have root formation, we are going to, again, start that acclimation process. We're going to start drying it down slowly. We're going to start encouraging that plant to rely on those new roots that it's formed. All right, a couple of other propagation methods. So first I wanted to cover layering. So this is where we are keeping these stems attached to the mother plant. And then we are going to create an environment around those stems that are still attached that will encourage rooting. Once we have a stem that has roots on it, we can detach it from the mother plant, and then we have a whole new plant. So again, this is called layering. It promotes a high success rate because it prevents that water stress and that carbohydrate storage that you might get from cuttings. So we're going to go through a couple of these different layering methods. So for tip layering, we're going to dig a hole that is 3 to 4 inches deep, and we're going to insert the shoot tip and cover it with soil. The tip grows downward at first, but then it's going to bend sharply back up. And then the roots will start to initiate right there at that bend. And then once we have that root initiation, again, we can go in, we can dig that out, and then cut below those roots and have access to a new plant. So a couple of example plants that this is effective with, we've got purple and black raspberries as well as the trailing blackberries. Excuse me. Compound layering. So this is a good method for plants with flexible stems. So we're going to bend the stem to the rooting medium, same way we did for simple layering, but then we're going to alternatively cover and expose the stem sections. So you can see that illustrated there in that drawing. You can wound the lower side of the stem sections to be covered. And this, again, is just a site that will promote root formation. So you can see there in that drawing, we have now created several sections of plants that we can then cut and create independent plants. So think about your plants that are flexible, your philodendrons, your pothos, and that is a good example of how we can do that. So with mound layering, we're going to cut the entire plant back to about 1 inch above ground in the dormant season. And then we're going to mound soil over the emerging shoots in the spring. And then this is going to encourage rooting. So gooseberry and apple stalks, that kind of thing. So again, we're just burying the whole plants. The The shoots are going to emerge, and then it's going to say, oh, I'm underground. I can start putting roots on myself, cut below those roots, and then we have new plants. Air layering. So this is successful for indoor plants with thick stems, or maybe we want to rejuvenate plants that have become leggy. So we're going to make a slit in that stem just below a node again. We're going to pry that slit open a little bit, and then we're going to surround that wound with wet, unmilled sphagnum moss. So again, that's just the coarser sphagnum moss. And then we're going to wrap that entire thing in plastic wrap or foil and use some ties to keep that in place. And then that will encourage root formation. And then once we have root formation, again, we can cut below that and we have a new plant. So this is something I'm excited to try on my own rubber tree. I have a variegated rubber tree that I am excited to propagate. And this is how I plan to do that. And then finally, good old division. A lot of us gardeners are very familiar with division, but it bears mentioning. So plants with more than one rooted crown can be divided, and the crowns can then be planted separately. If the stems are not joined, you can gently pull the plants apart. If the crowns are united by horizontal stems, you can cut those stems and the roots with a sharp knife to minimize injury. So divisions of some outdoor plants should be dusted with a fungicide before they're replanted. And then here's a few examples of things that we can do with this method. Dahlias, iris, rhubarb, daylilies. So that wraps up what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to leave about 15 minutes for questions. Before we move on to questions, again, a lot of this material was taken from a Purdue publication. So you can get a review of most of this information. Again, if you go to Google and you search Purdue Extension HO-37, and you'll find new plants from cuttings. So I am going to, first I'm going to allow participants to unmute, and let's have a conversation. Anybody have any questions or comments they want to bring up? Oh, I don't believe I covered it that thoroughly. Come on.
Do you have any experience with using natural stuff for rooting hormone like cinnamon or?
I have not heard of that actually. So I would have to do reading on that one before I could talk about using cinnamon as a rooting hormone.
Why do you say that we shouldn't save seeds from hybrid plants?
So there's different reasons. Sometimes those seeds are not going to be viable for hybrid plants. So if you think about, for example, the seedless watermelon. So first of all, you're not going to get seeds, right? But then keep in mind with those hybrids that we are more likely to lose those characteristics that we're trying to save. So we have a lot more variability in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Gus, I am glad you brought that question up. I'm totally excited to talk about that. So Gus asks, how can you propagate chestnut trees? So if we go over our history a little bit with chestnut, we know that we had a blight that wiped out a lot of our chestnut. So I actually knew a guy in one of these propagation nurseries that I used to visit that was grafting the American chestnut onto European chestnut rootstock, because that pathogen that caused that chestnut blight was soil-borne, and the European chestnut was resistant to this blight. So we were getting our American chestnut that we had lost being grown on the European rootstock that was resistant, so we could have the best of both worlds there. So otherwise, if I'm just going to propagate a chestnut, I might just assume that it's eventually going to get sick, but I'm probably just going to do that from seed, and I'm going to look into some of those stratification, scarification methods on those chestnuts as well. How do you, I'm going to jump around a little bit. How do you propagate coleus plants? Coleus are extremely easy. Take a cutting and put it in the water, and it will root quite rapidly. You can use a rooting hormone. There's no need. I would put that in straight water. It's going to root pretty quick, and then you can move that over into soil. How often to change water while rooting? I don't. I've not seen any need to. I will say that when I'm choosing my water, I have frequently used like deionized water or bottled water or something, because I personally have a water softener, so I don't want that water softener salt when I'm trying to roots. So, I think if you use the nice clean water to start with, so long as you're topping it off, and certain things will use that water more frequently than others. I think you can use that same water all along. Method is best for blueberry bushes. Blueberries, I can't say that I've ever tried rooting a blueberry. I imagine that it would be successful via cutting, but I would have to do more reading on that one. Gus, again, I'd have to go do some research on which methods to stratify a chestnut seed. So those of you asking about like where do you find information on seed requirements, for a lot of these native plants, you might find good resources with the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. But again, always do your search properly. Look for either a government source or an extension service, and look for a good research-backed information. Oh, do I hear somebody unmuting? Best time to divide irises. Oh, I've heard differing information on that. I've heard, end of season after they've gone down. And I've done that method, it's been fine. I've heard claims that you can do it early in the season before they bloom or before they emerge.
Carrie, I've tried air layering a rubber plant before. It was, make sure you watch how you cut it, because if you cut it wrong, it flops over.
Yeah, yeah.
The diagonal of the cut is important.
So that's my fear is I've got this beautiful, like we were saying, I've got this beautiful variegated rubber plant that I want to try that method on. But right now it's a single stem with no branching. And so it's going to kind of be an all or nothing moment when I do this. So yeah, I am going to have to be careful on that one. But I find that method to be interesting because it's one that you're watching right in front of your face. It's up in the air and you can see it happening.
Exactly. It was fun. I have a fiddle leaf too that this isn't propagating, but I'm trying to train it because it's so damn tall. But every time I cut on it, it just it doesn't branch like I want it to. So
yeah. Rosie, I have not propagated lilac. Has anybody propagated lilac?
does it depend on the kind? Because I've got a lilac that's invasive.
Well, hopefully we're not propagating the invasive species.
Man.
But I was going to imagine seed propagation from lilac. But again, if you're trying to maintain that one very specific trait, that might not be as reliable.
Carrie?
Uh-huh.
This is Rosie. A few years ago, I actually cut down the lilac to the ground and regrew the whole thing. And I've got new shoots coming up.
So that is something that I would kind of classify as like a rejuvenation pruning.
Yes, yes.
You know, for my master gardeners out there, you'll remember the rejuvenation and renewal pruning. So that's absolutely a strategy. Think about your pruning methods for woody plants. Barb suggested layering, and I bet that would work. So again, that's cutting it to the ground, and then when it starts to emerge, we're going to pile on that rooting or that soil so that the new sprouts are going to form some roots.
Hmm.
I bet that would work. Yeah.
Okay.
When do you cut it down? What season? I would probably cut it down early winter or maybe even late fall, just when it's done for the season. And that way, when it starts to sprout the following spring or early in that spring, we can get that soil on there to start the root initiation. Margot, I have heard that some roots that grow in water cannot take up nutrients appropriately when cutting is potted. Is this true for some types of plant, and if so, which plants? I've not heard that specifically, but what I will say is when we start transitioning, so let's say that we have been growing that cutting in water, it's had nothing but straight water, and now I'm going to put that in soil. I would not make any assumptions about that plant's ability to take up water. So when I first pot that up, so I've gone from straight water into soil, I'm going to keep that pot a little bit wetter. And then I'm going to slowly start drying it down, just like we did with the other pots in the presentation. I'm going to slowly start adapting it so that it starts to kind of harden itself off and it starts to rely on those roots a little bit more. So you might want to baby the roots that we are forming this way, treat them a little bit more gentle. And then kind of slowly start weaning them off of that very wet environment. Let's see, would azalea be considered a hardwood? So you mean which cutting method should we use there? Because remember the hardwood. I think I would probably either do softwood or semi-hardwood for an azalea. Azaleas can be a little bit more finicky. And again, those hardwood cuttings, remember that the hardwood means the previous season's growth. And that is the hardest of the methods to get those things to root. So I would try either again, softwood or semi-hardwood, that first year's growth on azalea, because they can be a little bit more temperamental, a little bit less hardy. Read that Christmas cactus, one should not root cuttings in the winter. I would imagine that's correct, Margot, that this is a life cycle question for that particular species. So that's just going to go back down to kind of knowing about the life cycle of that plant and when the best time to take them. I would believe that, yeah. All right, folks. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. You're always welcome to reach out with email. If you have any more questions or any suggestions for future lunch and learns, I'm always scrambling for topics. But
Harriet,
yeah, somebody have a question?
Where do you get seeds?
Where am I buying seeds?
Yeah,
So I typically get seed from trusted sources. I probably shouldn't give you a business name as a Purdue employee, but there are many options available online. Select Seed, Johnny Seed, lots of big companies out there that, have good reputations. So I can't claim to use any one company either. I'll use several different companies every year, but just a good, reliable, good reputation company.
thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.